The Hart Senate Office Building's Committee Room 216 had hosted countless congressional hearings throughout its decades of service, but none quite as explosive as what was about to unfold on this humid Thursday afternoon in June. The House Judiciary Committee's hearing on immigration enforcement had been scheduled as a routine oversight session, but the presence of Stephen Miller as a key witness had already generated significant media attention and public interest. Miller, serving as a senior advisor on immigration policy, had requested the opportunity to defend the administration's border security initiatives against what he characterized as unfair attacks from liberal politicians and activist groups. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat at the committee dais with her characteristic preparation and focus, but those familiar with her previous confrontations might have noticed an extra intensity in her demeanor. Her research into Miller's background and public statements had uncovered information that went far beyond standard policy disagreements, information that would ultimately expose one of the most disturbing ideological foundations underlying contemporary American immigration policy. She had hoped to keep the hearing focused on policy substance, but Miller's increasingly aggressive rhetoric and personal attacks had convinced her that extraordinary measures might be necessary to reveal the true nature of his motivations. The first 2 hours of the hearing proceeded along predictable lines, with Miller delivering polished talking points about border security, national sovereignty, and the rule of law. His responses were technically accurate, but revealed a coldness and calculation that made even routine policy discussions feel somehow sinister. His language was carefully chosen to avoid explicit extremism, while conveying unmistakable hostility toward immigrants and immigration advocates. Committee members asked standard questions about enforcement priorities, detention policies, and legal immigration pathways, receiving answers that sounded reasonable on their surface, but carried disturbing undertones for those listening carefully. Miller's confidence was evident throughout these exchanges. He had spent years perfecting his ability to present extremist positions in mainstream political language, and he believed himself untouchable due to his careful public messaging and powerful political protections. His contempt for his questioners was barely concealed, particularly when addressing Democratic committee members whom he clearly viewed as intellectually inferior and politically naive. The turning point came when Miller decided to make the hearing personal by directly attacking Jasmine's motivations and patriotism. Congresswoman Crockett, he said, his voice carrying a tone of calculated condescension, represents everything that's wrong with contemporary American politics. She prioritizes the interests of foreign nationals over American citizens, promotes policies that undermine national security, and frankly seems more concerned with advancing a radical anti-American agenda than protecting the people who elected her to office. The committee room fell silent at the unprecedented personal attack. While aggressive exchanges were common in congressional hearings, Miller's language crossed clear lines of decorum and professional conduct. Several committee members exchanged uncomfortable glances, recognizing that something significant was happening but not yet understanding its full implications. Jasmine's response was measured, but carried an edge that suggested she was shifting into a more aggressive mode. Mr. Miller, I find your comments about anti-American agendas particularly interesting, given your own ideological background and influences. Since you've raised questions about patriotism and loyalty to American values, perhaps we should examine those concepts more closely. She reached into her portfolio and withdrew her phone, placing it deliberately on the committee table. I'm particularly curious about your definition of American values and how they align with your private political philosophy and historical inspirations. Miller's confident expression flickered slightly as he sensed that something was wrong, but his arrogance prevented him from recognizing the magnitude of the trap he had walked into. I'm not sure what you're implying, Congresswoman, but my commitment to American values and constitutional principles is beyond question. Is it? Jasmine's finger hovered over her phone's play button, because I have recordings of private conversations that suggest your understanding of American values is quite different from what you've shared with this committee and the American people. The silence in Committee Room 216 was complete as committee members, staff, and observers realized they were about to witness something unprecedented. Miller's face had gone pale, and his usual composure was beginning to crack as he processed the implications of what Jasmine was suggesting. What you're about to hear, Jasmine announced to the hush committee room, is a recording from a private gathering that took place on October 31st of last year at the home of Richard Spencer in Arlington, Virginia. The gathering was attended by approximately 20 individuals who described themselves as members of the intellectual far-right movement. Mr. Miller was a featured speaker at this gathering, and his remarks were recorded by a concerned attendee who felt the American people should understand the true nature of his political philosophy. The audio that filled the committee room was crystal clear, obviously recorded on professional equipment rather than a hidden device. Miller's voice was unmistakable, and his words were devastating to everything he had claimed to represent about American values and constitutional principles. The recording captured him speaking to what was clearly a sympathetic audience about his genuine political philosophy and his long-term vision for American society. His tone was completely different from his public persona, less careful, more openly extremist, and brutally honest about his actual beliefs and inspirations. The most shocking portion of the recording came early, when Miller's voice could be heard praising historical figures and movements that represented the antithesis of American democratic values. I've always found the efficiency of the 1930s German immigration policies to be remarkable. His recorded voice stated matter-of-factly. The systematic approach to population management, the clarity of racial categories, and the decisiveness of enforcement actions represent exactly the kind of thinking we need to apply to our current immigration challenges. But the revelations became even more disturbing as the recording continued. Miller's voice could be heard discussing specific policy proposals that directly contradicted his public statements about constitutional limits and legal processes. The beauty of the German approach was that they understood that legal procedures and democratic processes are obstacles to effective population management, his voice said. We can learn from their example about how to work around constitutional constraints when the survival of the nation is at stake. The committee room erupted in gasps and horrified whispers as members processed what they were hearing. This wasn't just controversial political commentary. It was explicit praise for Nazi policies and methodology from someone who had been crafting American immigration policy for years. Several committee members appeared genuinely shocked, while others seemed to be processing information they had perhaps suspected but never heard confirmed so explicitly. The recording continued with Miller's assessment of American democratic institutions and their role in implementing his preferred policies. Democracy is fundamentally incompatible with effective immigration control, his voice stated with chilling casualness. The German National Socialists understood this, which is why they were able to achieve in a few years what democratic governments had failed to accomplish in decades. We need to think about how to apply similar efficiency to our own situation. But perhaps the most personally disturbing portion of the recording involved Miller's discussion of his own role in American government and his long-term strategy for implementing extremist policies. My position gives me unique opportunities to introduce concepts and approaches that would be rejected if presented honestly to the American people, his voice said. The key is incremental implementation and careful messaging that makes extreme measures seem reasonable and necessary. The silence that followed this revelation was different from the previous pauses. This wasn't shock or surprise. This was the sound of witnessing the complete exposure of a government official's hidden extremist agenda. The revelation that Miller had been deliberately deceiving the American people while implementing policies inspired by Nazi methodology represented a level of ideological corruption that few observers had ever imagined possible. Miller sat motionless in his witness chair, his face cycling through emotions of shock, fear, and what appeared to be resignation that his carefully hidden beliefs had been exposed in the most public forum possible. The authority and confidence that had characterized his public persona for years had completely evaporated, replaced by the look of someone watching his entire political career disintegrate in real time. But Jasmine's most devastating revelation was still to come. She produced a second recording device from her portfolio, this one containing audio from what appeared to be a more recent gathering. This recording is from February 14th of this year, Valentine's Day, at a private dinner in Georgetown. Mr. Miller was discussing his frustration with constitutional constraints on immigration enforcement and his admiration for what he called more decisive historical approaches to population problems. The second recording was even more explicit than the first in its praise for Nazi policies and its contempt for American democratic institutions. Miller's voice could be heard discussing specific strategies for circumventing constitutional protections and legal procedures in ways that directly echoed the methodology used by authoritarian regimes throughout history. Most devastatingly, the recording captured Miller expressing his ultimate vision for American society in terms that were unmistakably fascist in their scope and implications. The American experiment in democracy has been a failure when it comes to maintaining racial and cultural integrity, his voice said. We need to move beyond democratic processes toward more efficient forms of governance that can implement necessary population policies without interference from liberal institutions and minority populations. The committee room was in complete upheaval as the full scope of Miller's extremist ideology became clear. He wasn't just implementing harsh immigration policies. He was working to undermine American democratic institutions while drawing direct inspiration from Nazi Germany's approach to population control and ethnic cleansing. The implications for every policy he had influenced during his years in government were staggering and would require comprehensive review to fully address. Jasmine delivered her final statement with the gravity of someone who understood she was participating in a historic moment of democratic accountability. Mr. Miller, you came here today to question my patriotism and commitment to American values. You suggested that I represent an anti-American agenda that threatens our national security and constitutional principles. She gestured to the recording devices on the committee table. The evidence shows that you have spent years deceiving the American people about your true political philosophy while implementing policies inspired by Nazi methodology. You've worked to undermine constitutional protections while expressing contempt for the democratic institutions you've sworn to serve. Most importantly, you've used your position of trust to advance an extremist agenda that represents everything America fought against in World War II. The committee room erupted in sustained applause from the public gallery, with many people standing to acknowledge what they had witnessed. The applause continued for several minutes, representing not just approval of Jasmine's presentation, but recognition that they had witnessed a moment of genuine accountability in exposing ideological extremism at the highest levels of government. Committee security personnel began moving toward Miller, apparently having received instructions about how to handle the unprecedented situation. Within hours of the committee hearing, Miller announced his resignation from all government positions and withdrew from public political activity. The recordings were confirmed as authentic by multiple audio forensic experts, and the FBI announced that they would be investigating Miller's activities for potential violations of his oath of office and possible seditious conspiracy charges. The immediate aftermath sent shockwaves through American political culture and government institutions. Every policy Miller had influenced during his years in various government positions became subject to review, with particular attention paid to immigration enforcement actions that might have been motivated by extremist ideology rather than legitimate law enforcement concerns. Several high-profile deportation cases were immediately reviewed, and multiple families were reunited based on evidence that their separations had been motivated by racial animus rather than legal violations. For the immigration advocacy community, Miller's exposure represented validation of years of warnings about the extremist ideology underlying contemporary immigration enforcement. Advocates had long argued that Miller's policies were motivated by racial hatred and authoritarianism rather than legitimate security concerns, and the recordings provided definitive proof of these accusations. The revelations also triggered broader conversations about how extremist ideology had infiltrated American government institutions and what safeguards were needed to prevent similar infiltration in the future. 3 months after the committee hearing, Miller was indicted on multiple federal charges, including seditious conspiracy, violation of oath of office, and civil rights violations related to policies that had been implemented based on discriminatory motivations. His trial became a landmark case in American law, establishing important precedents about the criminal liability of government officials who implement policies based on extremist ideologies while deceiving the public about their true motivations. For Jasmine, the encounter represented another milestone in her career as a defender of democratic institutions and constitutional values. Her decision to expose Miller's extremist ideology demonstrated her commitment to transparency and accountability regardless of political consequences. The success also reinforced her reputation as one of the most thorough and fearless congressional oversight practitioners of her generation. But the victory came with significant personal costs and risks. Jasmine faced death threats from extremist groups who viewed Miller as a hero and her as a traitor to white American interests. Federal security agencies provided enhanced protection for her and her family, understanding that her exposure of Miller had made her a target for domestic terrorists and white supremacist organizations. The broader impact on American political discourse was profound and lasting. The Miller case demonstrated that extremist ideology could penetrate the highest levels of government when individuals were willing to deceive the public about their true beliefs and motivations. It showed that ongoing vigilance and thorough oversight were essential for maintaining democratic institutions and preventing authoritarian infiltration. The case also highlighted the importance of whistleblowers and inside information in exposing extremist ideology that was carefully hidden behind mainstream political messaging. Without the courage of individuals who attended Miller's private gatherings and recorded his true beliefs, the American people might never have learned about the Nazi-inspired ideology that had been shaping their government's immigration policies. 6 months after Miller's exposure and indictment, the federal government had implemented comprehensive reforms designed to identify and remove extremist ideology from policymaking processes. The reforms included enhanced background investigations for senior policy positions, regular ideological audits of government decisions, and new protocols for reporting suspected extremist activity by government officials. For white supremacist and neo-Nazi movements affected by Miller's exposure, the revelations represented a devastating blow to their strategy of mainstreaming extremist ideology through conventional political channels. Miller had been one of their most successful infiltrators of American government, and his dramatic downfall sent a clear message that such infiltration carried enormous risks and would be aggressively prosecuted when discovered. As both Jasmine and American democratic institutions moved forward from the Miller scandal, the lessons of that June afternoon in Committee Room 216 remained as a reminder of both the fragility and the resilience of democratic governance. Jasmine had shown that thorough investigation and strategic courage could expose even the most carefully hidden extremist ideology when individuals were willing to risk their safety for democratic accountability. The American government had learned that constant vigilance against ideological infiltration was essential for maintaining the constitutional principles that define the nation's identity. The confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Stephen Miller would be remembered as a defining moment in the ongoing struggle to maintain democratic institutions against extremist infiltration and ideological corruption. It demonstrated that even the most carefully disguised authoritarianism could be exposed and defeated when dedicated individuals were willing to seek truth and demand accountability from those who had betrayed the public trust through deception and extremist ideology.